She was the plainest at the auction. The cattle baron said, "Beauty fades, she won't." The auctioneer had a voice like a man trying to sell water in a flood. Too loud, too sure of himself, reading off the women like he was calling livestock at Abilene. I'd stood through 6 of them already. 6 women walked up on that platform in front of the mercantile, the afternoon sun hammering the street dust into a yellow haze, and I'd stood with my hat in my hands and watched the other men elbow each other and grin and bid like it was a horse race. I wasn't there for a race. I was 53 years old. I had 14,000 acres of grass north of the Cimarron, a house built out of limestone that took 2 years to finish, and a cook named Delfino who made the best green chili in 3 territories, but who also had the habit of singing at 4 in the morning when he thought no one could hear. I had cattle. I had hands. I had more than most men I'd known had ever dreamed of having. I also had a dining room that sat 12, and had never once sat more than 3. My foreman, Cass Aldridge, had talked me into this. He'd done it the way Cass did everything, quietly, while pretending to talk about something else. We'd been out checking the fence line along the north pasture, and he'd mentioned there was a bride auction in Hardwick on the 14th, and that a man in my position might do well to attend, and then he'd looked out across the grass and not said another word about it. That was Cass. He'd learned, over 20 years of working for me, that the direct approach bounced off me like a thrown stone off adobe. I'd told myself I was only going to look. I was good at telling myself things. 7 women. That's how many had come up on that platform by the time Eula Renner walked out of the mercantile's side door and took the 3 steps up. I noticed her because she moved differently than the others. The others had walked out with something arranged about them, hair done in a particular way, a dress that caught the light, eyes either cast down shy or lifted bright with what they hoped looked like confidence. Eula Renner walked out like she was crossing a yard to check on a fence post. Purposeful, not performing. She was, as the auctioneer said with the kind of cheerfulness that made you want to hit him, a handsome woman of practical disposition. Which was how a man like that said, not pretty, not the kind of face that made men stop mid-sentence. Brown hair pulled back plain, a jaw that was a little strong, eyes set a little deep, skin that had seen weather, medium height, nothing that drew the eye immediately and held it. I was 40 feet back from the platform, standing at the edge of the crowd, and I watched the men around me the way I sometimes watched cattle when I was trying to read their mood. There were maybe 30 men there from the county and the territories beyond. Ranchers, merchants, a couple of cowboys who had pooled their money and decided to try their luck. And I watched them look at Eula Renner, and I watched most of them look away again. Not all, but most. The bidding started low and stayed low, $80, $90. A man named Purvis who owned a dry goods near the river pushed it to 110, and the auctioneer said, "Do I hear 120?" with somewhat less conviction than he'd used for the woman before her, who'd had red hair and a laugh you could hear from the end of the block. I stood there with my hat in my hands. I had not intended to bid on anyone. I had meant only to look, and then to go back to my limestone house and my dining room that never held more than 3 people, and my 4-in-the-morning singing cook, and make my peace with it all over again the way I'd been making my peace with it for the past 8 years, which is to say badly and quietly, which is the only way a man in my position could do it without losing the respect of his hands. But I watched Eula Renner standing on that platform, and I noticed something the other men were too busy being disappointed to see. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't ashamed of herself. She was looking out over that crowd with an expression that I couldn't immediately name, and it took me a moment to place it, and when I did, I almost smiled. She was assessing us. She was standing up there being sold, which ought to have been the most humiliating position a woman could occupy, and she was looking at us the way a rancher looks at a remuda, not with hope, not with desperation, but with clear and somewhat skeptical eyes, weighing each man she saw against some private standard she'd already worked out for herself. I bid $130. Purvis at the dry goods looked back at me. He knew who I was. Most men in 3 counties knew who I was, which was its own kind of loneliness, but that's a longer story. He looked at me, and then he looked at Eula Renner, and he weighed his options, and he let it go. The auctioneer said, "Sold," with what I thought was mild relief. Eula Renner looked across the crowd to find who'd bid, and her eyes found me the way a compass needle finds north, without drama and without delay. She looked at me for 3 or 4 seconds, not sizing me up the way a woman looks at a man she's hoping to please, more like she was making a note. Then she came down off the platform. We stood together at the edge of the street while the auction moved on to the next woman, and I said, "I'm Harlan Creed. I run the Creed Ranch on the Cimarron." And she said, "I know who you are. I asked around before I came to this." And I said, "What did you find out?" And she said, "That you're fair with your hands, you don't drink to excess, and you lost your wife 8 years ago and haven't been the same since." And then she looked at me with those set-back eyes that missed nothing and said, "That last part I already knew just from looking." I didn't know what to do with that. Nobody had said anything that plain to me in a very long time. Her name was Eula Renner. She was 41. She'd been born in Ohio, come west with a husband who died of a lung fever outside of Dodge City, and had spent the last 3 years keeping books for a grain merchant in Hardwick who'd had the bad grace to go bankrupt and leave her without a situation. She had a sister in Missouri and no strong desire to go back there. She had $60 of her own money in a flat purse that she kept in the inside pocket of her coat. She told me all of this standing beside the auction crowd as though she were giving a deposition, with a kind of clean directness that I found unsettling, the way you find a well-plumbed wall unsettling when you're used to working in falling down buildings. I said, "You're not what I expected." She said, "I'm generally not." We were married 3 days later by Judge Arbuckle, who was also the land recorder and notary and did funerals when the circuit preacher was south. It took about 6 minutes. Cass was the only witness. He stood outside the judge's office in the morning sun with his hat in his hands, and when it was done he shook my hand and said, "Good," and then went to go check on the horses, which was a considerable act of warmth from Cass. I drove Eula out to the ranch in the buckboard. It was a 2-hour ride. We didn't talk much. I pointed out the boundaries of the property when we crossed them, and she asked a few questions about the grass conditions and the water situation, and I answered them, and neither of us tried to fill the silence with anything false. The house surprised her. I saw it when we came up the rise and the limestone caught the afternoon sun. She went quiet in a particular way, and she looked at it a long time before she said anything. Then she said, "You built this yourself?" Not a question. I said yes. She said, "It'll last 100 years. And something in me that had been held at attention I hadn't fully noticed loosened a little at that. I showed her the house. She looked at the kitchen first, which was practical and which I respected. She looked at the dining room second. She stood in it for a moment and looked at the long table and the 12 chairs and the 2 windows that looked west over the grass. I didn't say anything. She said, "You eat alone in here?" I said most nights, yes. She nodded and moved on to look at the rest. Delfino made supper that night, and he was so overwhelmed by the presence of a woman at the table that he nearly burned the beans and kept appearing in the doorway to ask questions about things he didn't need answers to. Eula spoke to him in halting Spanish, which surprised him into a kind of stunned good humor. They were, within 3 days, formidably allied, which was both a relief and a mild concern. The first weeks were quiet. We were careful with each other the way people are when they're sharing a space and don't yet know the rules. I was up before dawn, out to the barns, and she rose not long after me, and by the time I came in for the midday meal she had already talked with Delfino, gone over the household accounts, and I discovered on the 3rd day walked the fence line along the south pasture on her own to see what state it was in. I stood in the kitchen with mud on my boots and looked at her when she came back in and said, "You walked the south fence." She said, "It needs work in 3 places. I'll show you on the map if you have one." I had a map. She showed me on the map. She was right about all 3 places. I thought about Purvis at the dry goods and his $110. I thought about the 30 men who'd looked at Eula Renner on that platform and looked away. I didn't say anything about that, but I thought about it. There is a thing that happens when a man builds something big and does it mostly alone. The ranch, the land, the operation, all the years of grinding work and decision-making and whether that didn't care about him and markets that were indifferent and men who sometimes respected him and sometimes didn't. There is a thing that happens where you get so used to being the one who knows, the one who decides, the one who holds it all together, that you stop expecting anyone to see it. You stop expecting anyone to look at the thing you've built and understand what it cost. People see the result, the limestone house, the cattle, the land. They see the outcome and they assess it. They don't see the years. I had stopped expecting to be seen. Eula saw. Not on the first day, not in any dramatic moment. It came slowly, the way water finds its level. She watched how I worked. She watched how I was with the hands, firm but straight, no games, no favorites except by merit, hard when it needed to be and then done. She watched how I handled a bad situation in early October when a lightning strike touched off a grass fire on the East Range, and we spent 2 days fighting it and lost about 200 acres of good grazing before it was done. I came in from that black-eared and ash-covered and so tired I couldn't think straight, and she had food hot and a clean shirt laid out, and she poured me a cup of coffee and sat across from me while I ate, and she didn't say a word about the land we'd lost. She said, "Your hands held. They didn't break." And I looked up at her across that table in the kitchen, and she was looking back at me with an expression that, it took me a moment, and then I knew what it was. It was the look of someone who has watched a man under pressure and has drawn a conclusion she is satisfied with. I didn't know how much I'd needed that until I felt it land. There was a morning in November. Cold had come down hard, the first real cold of the season, and I was out before light checking the water troughs to make sure they hadn't frozen solid. My hands were already gone half numb, and the sky was going from black to a color that wasn't quite any color, and I was crouched down at the east trough with a piece of iron working at the ice crust when I heard the door of the barn open, and she came in with a lantern in one hand and a pair of my old gloves in the other. She handed me the gloves without a word. I put them on. She set the lantern down on the fence post and crouched beside me and held the light steady while I worked. We didn't speak for the better part of an hour. It was too cold and there was too much work. But she was there through all of it, moving from trough to trough with me, holding the light, her breath making small white clouds in the lamplight, her jaw set against the cold in a way that had no complaint in it. When we came back in and I held the door for her and followed her into the kitchen where Delfino was already building the fire up, she turned to look at me with cold-reddened cheeks and her hair come a little loose from its pins, and she said, 14,000 acres is a lot of troughs. And I said, 41. And she said, I counted 42. And I looked at her, and she had that slight set to her mouth that was as close as she usually came to a smile. I said there might be 42. I went to bed that night thinking about a woman I'd been married to for 13 years and buried 8 years past, and what I thought was, Alina would have liked her. It was the most honest tribute I could pay to either of them, and I let myself think it, and then I let it rest. December came, and with it a cold that settled in and didn't move. The hands spent most of their time keeping cattle from drifting in the wind, and keeping the water from freezing and doing the 1,000 small, dull, necessary things that winter on the Cimarron demanded. I was up every morning before 4, to bed after 9, and the work in between was the same kind of work that had been my whole life for 30 years, and would be my whole life for as many years as I had left in me to do it. What was different was coming inside. Coming inside to a kitchen that smelled of food. Coming inside and finding someone already aware of the shape of my day, the problems I'd been working on, the decision I needed to make about the North Herd before the worst of the cold settled in. Eula had a mind that organized information the way a good bookkeeper does, not in the emotional way, not in the way of someone trying to help you feel better about things, but precisely, clearly, in a way that was actually useful. She could hold 3 problems in her head at once and set them out in order of importance when asked. I hadn't known I missed that, the ability to think aloud to someone who would think back. There was an evening in the second week of December. Cass had come in for supper, which he did occasionally, and the 3 of us sat at the long table in the dining room, 3 people in the room built for 12, and talked through the problem of the north fence and the spring calving, and what I was likely to do about the Harlow brothers who ran cattle adjacent to my east range, and had been letting them drift onto my grass since September. Cass had his views. Eula had questions that pushed on the problem in ways Cass, and I hadn't thought to push on it. By the end of supper, we had a plan that was better than anything I'd come in with. After Cass left and Delfino went to sleep, Eula and I sat at the table a while longer. The fire was burning low and the lamplight made the limestone walls warm. She was looking over the account book she'd been keeping, and I was doing nothing in particular, which I almost never did, just sitting. After a while she said, without looking up, "Do you know what Purvis at the dry goods told people after the auction?" I said I didn't. She said, "He told them you'd made a mistake, paid good money for plain goods." She said it the way she said everything, flat and even, without weight put on it, just the fact. I looked at her for a moment, the lamplight on her face, the set of her jaw. The eyes that were set a little deep and missed nothing. I said, "Purvis is a fool." She looked up at me then, those clear, set-back eyes. She said, "I know why you bid." I said, "Do you?" She said, "Because I wasn't pretending to be anything. and you've been surrounded by pretending for long enough that you know what the real thing looks like. I didn't answer that right away, not because it wasn't true. Because it was entirely true, and because I'd never put it that plainly to myself. And hearing it said plainly in that kitchen, in that house I'd built, by that woman, by this woman who'd walked onto an auction platform with $60 in her coat, and assessed a crowd of men with quiet eyes and landed here, at this table, and seen through me as clear as glass, I had to sit with it for a moment. I said, the night of the auction, when you were looking out at the crowd. She said, yes. I said, what did you see when you looked at me? She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking of what to say, but the quiet of someone deciding whether to say what they've already thought. Then she said, a man who'd built something real and spent a long time doubting whether any of it mattered. The fire popped. The lamp gave its small, steady light. I said, and you stayed anyway. She said, I stayed because of it. There is a kind of quiet that comes after something true is spoken that is different from ordinary quiet. I know that sounds like something out of a book, but I'm just trying to say what it was. We sat in it for a while, her with her account book, me with nothing in my hands and nothing that needed to be in them. After a time, she closed the account book and put it to the side, and she looked at me and she said, it's late. And she got up and came around the table to where I was sitting, and she put her hand on my shoulder, just her hand resting there, the weight of it, warm through my shirt, and stood beside me a moment. Not a dramatic thing, not something from a dime novel. Just a woman standing beside a man she'd chosen, letting him know she was there and that she intended to stay. I put my hand over hers. We stood like that for maybe a minute, and then she went to bed, and I sat there a while longer in my limestone house that took 2 years to build, at my dining room table that could seat 12, with the fire burning low and the cold outside pressing against the walls. And I thought about what it was to have spent a long time being a man of considerable account, and to have been all that time somehow invisible to the one thing that would have mattered. And then I thought, not anymore. January was hard. It always was on the simmerin'. There were weeks where the temperature didn't get above 10 degrees, and the wind came out of the northwest like something with a personal grievance, and there was nothing poetic about any of it, just work, cold, and the particular kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones by January and doesn't fully leave until April. The cattle needed constant tending. 3 of the hands got sick with a chest ailment that laid them up for a week and left us short-handed in the worst possible stretch. I was sleeping 5 hours a night, and it showed. Eula held the household end of things without being asked, and without fanfare, and without making me feel managed, which was a thing I would not have tolerated, and which she seemed to understand instinctively. She was not a woman who tried to smooth things over or make them seem better than they were. When things were hard, she treated them as hard and dealt with what was in front of her. There was a morning in the 3rd week of January when I came in after 16 hours straight, and she set a plate in front of me and said, "Eat this, then sleep. Cass has the morning." I started to say I needed to be up at 4, and she said, "Cass has the morning," and looked at me with those level eyes, and I ate the food and I slept until 6, and the world did not end, and when I woke, Cass had the morning handled exactly as it needed to be handled. I lay in bed for a moment before I got up. The house was warm. I could hear Delfino in the kitchen, and I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. I hadn't known that. I had known other versions of it earlier in my life, but I'd been so long without it that I'd forgotten this was what it was supposed to feel like, and it took a woman being in the house, steady and without pretense, and seeing me clearly to remind me. The spring came the way spring comes on the Cimarron, not gently, not all at once, but in argument with winter, back and forth, a warm week and then a cold snap, mud and then freeze and then mud again. The calving started in March, and it was a good year, better than the past 2, and by mid-April we had numbers that made Cass smile, which was so rare that Delfino and I discussed it separately. There was a day in late April. The grass was coming in strong, and the sky was doing that thing it does in late spring in that country, a blue so sharp it almost hurts, with the white clouds stacked high, and the light making everything exact and clear. I was out on horseback checking the south range when I saw Eula on the fence line ahead of me. She was on her own horse, one of the sorrel mares I'd said she could use, and she was looking out over the grass with one hand on the saddle horn. I rode up alongside her. We sat there a while without talking. The grass was moving in the wind. There were cattle visible in the distance, grazing, small and dark against all that green. The sound of them and the sound of the wind and nothing else. She said, in Ohio, where I grew up, there was 40 acres my father farmed. I thought 40 acres was a large thing. She looked out across the range. This is a different scale. I said, does it bother you? She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. Then she said, no, it means there's always something. You never run out of something to do. I looked at her on that sorrel mare with the April light on her face and the grass moving behind her. And I thought about the man who'd stood at the back of a crowd in Hardwick with his hat in his hands and no expectation of finding anything worthwhile in that day. And I thought about the one decision he'd made that had changed the whole sound of his life. I said, Eula. She looked at me. I said, I bid on you because you were looking at us like you were deciding something. Most of those women wanted someone to choose them. You were doing the choosing yourself, even from up there. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, I'd already decided when you bid. I said, what do you mean? She said, I saw you at the back of the crowd before the auction started. The way you stood, the way you were watching, not performing. I thought, if that man bids, that's the one. She looked at me steadily. And then you bid. The wind moved through the grass. One of the cattle in the distance made a low sound that carried. I said, you could have said something. She said, I'm saying it now. She put her horse alongside mine so they were shoulder to shoulder, and she reached over and took my hand where it rested on my saddle horn. Just took it in both of hers the way you'd take something you intended to keep. And she looked at me across the space between the horses with those clear eyes, and she said, you built something worth being part of, Harlan Creed. I intend to be part of it for a long time. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have improved on that. We rode back to the house together, her hand in mine until the horses needed more room and we had to let go. And when we came up over the rise and the limestone house caught the late afternoon sun and the whole of the South Range lay out behind us, I thought about what it was to have spent 30 years building something and to have believed for the last 8 of them that you were building it for no one. You build it anyway. That's what a man does. You build it because the work itself is the answer to whatever question you're living inside of, and because not building it would be a worse thing than building it for no one. You build it and you get up every morning, and you do what the day requires, and you are tired. And sometimes you are lonely in a way that has no remedy, and you do not speak of it, because speaking of it changes nothing and there is always more work. And then one day a woman walks onto an auction platform in front of a mercantile in a dusty town, and looks out over a crowd of men with clear and slightly skeptical eyes. And she sees you, in the back, being nobody's performance, and she decides. And that, I have found, is the whole of it. The house sits on a rise above the South Range. In the evenings in summer, the light comes through the west windows of the dining room and lies across the long table. And sometimes we sit there, the two of us, not eating yet, just sitting in that light. And she'll be working on the accounts or writing a letter, and I'll be doing nothing in particular, which I have gotten better at. Delfino sings at 4 in the morning. He always has. But it is a different thing to lie in the dark and hear it now. It is a different thing when you are not alone in the hearing of it. The grass is good this year. The cattle are fat. The water is where it ought to be in all 42 troughs. That's what a man my age has. That's what it comes to in the end if he's lived it right. Good land, good cattle, good water, and someone beside him who knows what it cost and stayed anyway. The rest is just weather.